The year was 2018, and the place was a small, secluded cabin in the woods of Oregon. My name is Aaron, and I was 29 years old when I found myself out there. It wasn't supposed to be anything dramatic, just a weekend getaway to clear my head. I had recently gone through a rough patch in my life, an unexpected breakup, some family drama, and a ton of work stress. My uncle, Mark, owned the cabin, and he'd always told me I could stay there whenever I needed. So one Friday afternoon, I loaded my old truck with camping gear and drove up. The cabin itself was simple: 2 rooms, a porch, and a wood-burning stove. It was old but sturdy, sitting at the edge of a dense pine forest with no other houses for miles. The perfect place to escape and get some peace and quiet, or so I thought. I arrived as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with a deep orange and purple hue. The air had that crisp, almost chilly quality that you get in the early autumn. After unloading my things, I started a fire in the stove and opened a can of beans. There was no electricity or running water, but it didn't bother me. The simplicity of it all was exactly what I needed. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves. It was peaceful. I spent the evening reading a book by the fire, my dog, Buster, curled up at my feet. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. I noticed the wind picking up, howling through the trees like something was pushing against them. I thought about turning in for the night, but the wind intrigued me. I had never really been out here during a storm before, and the sound of the trees swaying unnerved me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Buster started to whine, his ears flicking back every few seconds, a sign that something was off. I reassured him and rubbed his head, but the unease in the pit of my stomach only grew stronger. There was something about the way the wind moved through the trees. It was different, almost unnatural. The storm picked up quickly. The wind slammed into the cabin, making the wood creak and groan. I tried to ignore it, but the thought of being out here alone with just Buster for company started to feel less peaceful. My uncle had warned me about the area. "There's something off about that part of the woods," he'd said, but I always brushed it off as his way of scaring me. Now, I wasn't so sure. By 2 a.m., the storm was at its peak. Rain was pounding against the roof, and the wind was fierce enough to rattle the cabin's foundation. Buster was still on edge, pacing around and occasionally barking at the door as if something was outside. I had no idea what it could be. Maybe a deer or a raccoon, though they usually didn't come this close to the cabin. I decided to step outside and check on the situation. With the rain coming down hard, I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The wind hit me instantly, and the rain was like cold needles against my face. Buster was at my side, barking insistently as if he wanted to go with me. I shone the flashlight around the yard. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but the outline of trees and the rain-soaked ground. It was strange how silent the woods were. I expected to hear animals, maybe the rustling of small creatures, but there was nothing, just the wind and rain. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Felt like someone was watching me. I turned back to the cabin, but then I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, there was a figure standing in the shadows. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was imagining it. But as I focused, I could see it more clearly, tall, gaunt, and unmoving with a dark, hooded shape. My heart skipped a beat. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the storm. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just passing by. It was watching me. I stepped back into the cabin and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with shaky hands. Buster was now barking nonstop, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I tried to reassure myself, but the unease was growing. The figure had been too still, too silent. It wasn't normal. I spent the next several hours trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The storm was playing tricks on me, but every time I looked out the window, I saw nothing. The figure was gone. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the woods drenched and eerily quiet. I was exhausted but decided to take Buster for a walk, hoping some fresh air would clear my head. The woods, however, looked different in the daylight. The trees seemed taller, more oppressive. I kept expecting to see the figure from the night before lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. I spent the next couple of days trying to enjoy my stay, but the unease never quite left. I was on edge, constantly checking my surroundings, listening for any sound that might indicate someone was nearby. On the third evening, things took a turn for the worse. I had just finished making dinner when I heard something outside the cabin. A rustling, a crack of a branch underfoot. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Buster immediately went to the door, barking again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, determined to face whatever was lurking. The forest was quiet again, the only sound the distant trickle of water from the storm. But this time, there was something more. A faint, dragging sound coming from deeper in the woods. I couldn't tell what it was, but it sounded like someone, or something, was moving through the underbrush slowly, deliberately. I called out again, my voice shaky. "Hello?" No answer, just the dragging sound growing closer. Panic began to rise in my chest. I turned to go back inside, but I froze when I saw a shadow move between the trees. Not a person, but something else. A figure that was too fast, too jerky in its movements. I slammed the door shut, but the sound didn't stop. It was as if something was circling the cabin, studying it from all angles. My mind raced. What if it was a trap? What if someone was out there, waiting for me to make a mistake? I spent the night in the cabin, sitting in the corner with Buster, both of us wide awake. The sounds outside grew louder, more insistent. Whatever was out there, it wasn't leaving. By morning, the sounds had stopped, and I was finally able to sleep for a few hours, only to be woken by a knock on the door. I jumped up, heart pounding. Who could be out here? I hadn't seen anyone for days, and I hadn't heard any vehicles. I slowly opened the door, half expecting to see the figure from before. Instead, standing there was a man, disheveled, with wild eyes and a look of exhaustion. He was in his late 40s, covered in dirt and leaves, looking like he had been out in the woods for days. "I've been lost," he said hoarsely. "Can you help me? I'm trying to get back to town." His clothes were torn, his face gaunt, and his voice had an edge of desperation. Something about him didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't leave him out there. I had no choice but to let him in. He told me he had been camping in the woods but got separated from his group. When I asked him where they were, he grew quiet, his eyes darting around the room as if he didn't want to answer. I offered him some food and we sat in silence for a while. But as the evening drew near, the unease I had been feeling all week came rushing back. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong about this situation. It wasn't until he excused himself to use the bathroom that I noticed something strange. His backpack, which he had left by the door, wasn't just a typical camping pack. I could see something bulging from it, something too long to be a tent pole or a sleeping bag. My curiosity got the best of me and I opened the bag. Inside, I found a knife large with a jagged edge and a blood-stained shirt. I didn't know what to do. My heart raced as I turned toward the bathroom door, which was now ajar. I could see his shadow in the doorway. He was watching me. I didn't wait. I grabbed Buster's leash and ran out the back door into the woods. I didn't look back until I reached the nearby highway, where I flagged down a car. The police came, but the man was gone. They never found him or his group. I couldn't stop shaking as I told them everything, but no one believed me fully. They thought it was just the stress of isolation getting to me. I don't know what he was doing out there. Maybe he was just a lost hiker. Maybe something more sinister. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle never knew what happened either. When I told him, he only shrugged it off as me overthinking. But I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. And I'll never forget the sight of that knife in his bag. It had been years since I'd driven past her cabin. Years since the divorce, since everything fell apart. But something in me couldn't resist. I had to see it again, not just to revisit the past, but to close a door that never fully shut. The road was just as I remembered, narrow, winding, and almost claustrophobic, sandwiched between thick forests. The kind of place where if you broke down, you'd be lucky if someone found you in a week. I hadn't been back here since we split up, since she'd packed her things and left, leaving me alone with the memories. I wasn't sure what drew me to her cabin now. Maybe it was closure, maybe curiosity. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The sun had long set by the time I turned onto the old dirt road that led to the cabin. I hadn't expected to feel anything driving here, but I did. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from something else, something unspoken. The weight of the past seemed to press against the air itself. The trees, thick and dark, closed in on me as the headlights of my truck illuminated the rough path ahead. I could already see the silhouette of the cabin up ahead, tucked between two tall pines. It hadn't changed much since I last saw it. Weathered wood, a stone chimney puffing smoke into the crisp air, and that familiar porch where we used to sit on summer nights. The place was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. I parked the truck at the edge of the gravel driveway, cutting the engine and sitting in silence for a moment. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath, like it was waiting for me to do something. The place had been abandoned for a few years now, yet it still seemed so alive. I could almost hear the echoes of old conversations in the wind, the memories of laughter and fights, and everything in between. I stepped out of the truck, the ground beneath my boots crunching with each step. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and I felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with unease. I didn't know why I was here. To confront the past? To find peace? I had no answers. I started walking toward the cabin, my footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass and dead leaves scattered across the yard. As I approached the porch, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. The cabin looked different now, more forlorn, more distant. The door creaked when I nudged it open, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Inside, the furniture was mostly gone, save for a few remnants of the life we once shared. An old chair, a dusty table, and the cracked floorboards. But the silence, it was almost oppressive. It was a silence that seemed to have been waiting for me. I walked in, my boots echoing in the hollow space, and instantly, my eyes were drawn to the window at the far end of the room. It was cracked open, just enough to let the cold night air in. Outside, the forest beyond the cabin loomed dark and endless. A sense of being watched crept over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just the weight of the past that I was carrying with me. I stepped closer to the window, the floor creaking under my weight. The trees in the distance shifted in the wind, their branches swaying like they were trying to whisper something. Then I saw something move. It was quick, barely noticeable, but my heart skipped a beat. Someone was standing at the edge of the tree line. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person, their figure dark against the night. My instincts told me to step back, to leave, but I couldn't. I stood there, staring at the figure for what felt like an eternity. The wind howled through the trees, and the silence of the cabin pressed down even harder. Then, in one smooth motion, the figure turned and vanished into the woods. I blinked, trying to process what I had just seen. Had it been a person? Or had my mind been playing tricks on me? I had no choice but to go outside and check. My legs felt heavy as I stepped off the porch, the air colder now. The trees surrounding the cabin seemed to close in on me, their long shadows stretching across the ground, reaching for me. I didn't even realize how fast my pulse was racing until I was halfway down the porch steps. I walked toward the tree line, my breath visible in the crisp air, fogging up in front of my face. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no movement. The ground was hard, the earth solid. Nothing. It was as if the figure had never been there at all. But I knew what I saw. My heart was still pounding in my chest, a lingering tension curling in my stomach. I turned around to head back to the cabin, but then I froze. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement again. This time, it was closer, too close, and before I could react, the unmistakable sound of something snapping beneath weight, a branch breaking, came from the woods. I spun around, my heart thumping in my chest. My breath hitched. A man. He was standing in the middle of the woods, just beyond the tree line. His face obscured by shadow, but I could feel his gaze on me. He wasn't moving, just staring. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to do. Something inside me screamed to run, to get back in the truck and leave, but my feet were frozen to the ground. A sense of dread spread over me like a thick fog. He was still standing there, and for the first time in years, I felt fear grip me in a way that I hadn't felt since we were together. My mind raced, trying to figure out who this person could be, but there was no one I knew who would be out here, not this time of night. I had to get out of there. I turned and bolted back toward the cabin, every step feeling heavier than the last. The sound of branches cracking underfoot behind me made my heart race. I didn't dare look back. I reached the porch and slammed the door shut behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. My breath was coming in short, jagged bursts as I leaned against the door, trying to calm myself. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay here, not with him out there, not with the memory of everything that went wrong between us still haunting the walls. I grabbed my keys, started the truck, and didn't look back. The road to the cabin had always felt like a place of refuge, but tonight, it was nothing but a path into something darker. As I drove away, the cabin's outline faded behind me, swallowed by the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something that had been waiting for me to return. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure in the woods following me. But there was nothing. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet, just as it always had been. Yet I knew I couldn't come back here, not ever again. And as I turned off the road and onto the main highway, the cold, unsettling feeling didn't leave me. The past was behind me, but it was far from gone. I had never been one for the idea of staying in cabins, especially not in the deep, rugged parts of the mountains. But when Jason, my old college buddy, invited me for a weekend in the wilderness, I figured it would be a good way to get away from the city for a while. The noise, the stress, the people, it was all getting to me. I needed peace, and I thought this would be the perfect way to disconnect. Jason had inherited an old cabin from his grandfather, who had passed away a few years ago. The cabin was located deep in the hills of Wyoming, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. I wasn't sure why anyone would want to live that far out, but it was his family's place and he loved it. So, when he mentioned he wanted to spend a weekend there to clear his head, I figured it would be a quiet and relaxing escape from my hectic life. The drive up was long and tedious. The weather had been getting colder as we approached the hills, and by the time we reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. Jason parked the truck in front of the old wooden structure, which looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The wood was weathered, the windows covered in grime, and the chimney gave off a faint smell of wood smoke. but it was a cabin, nothing special. To most people, it would be a place you stayed for a weekend to escape, but for me, it felt more like a relic, frozen in time. "I know it's not much," Jason said, stepping out of the truck, "but it's cozy enough. And trust me, once you're here, you'll forget about everything." I nodded, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The trees around the cabin were dense and dark, the kind that made the woods seem endless. The air was still, and the silence was almost too heavy.
No birds chirped.
No wind blew through the branches, just an eerie quiet that made my skin prickle. We gathered our bags and headed inside. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms, the main living space and a tiny kitchen area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a large, worn-out couch sat near it. It smelled of old wood and dust. Jason seemed comfortable, pulling a few logs from a nearby stack and tossing them into the fireplace. "Place looks worse than I remember," Jason muttered as he poked at the logs with a metal poker. "But it's still the best spot to get away from the world." I sat down on the couch, trying to get comfortable, but the tension in the air didn't ease. There was something unsettling about the place. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I sat there, the more it gnawed at me. As the night wore on, Jason cracked open a bottle of bourbon, and we shared stories, trying to make the best of the situation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind had started picking up, rustling the trees outside, and the shadows cast by the fire flickered unnaturally against the walls. I told myself it was just the isolation and the dark of night playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It was soft at first, like nails scraping against wood. I paused, glancing at Jason, who hadn't seemed to notice. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. "Hear what?" he replied, looking up from his drink. I hesitated. Sounded like scratching, like something was outside. Jason laughed, a short, nervous chuckle. "Probably a raccoon or something. You're not used to the woods, man. It's always animals out here." I nodded, trying to calm my nerves. Still, that sound, soft and persistent, kept gnawing at me. I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't go away. It was like something was pacing outside the cabin, waiting. Eventually, the fire dwindled, and the night grew colder. We decided to turn in. The bedrooms were small, with old wooden beds and threadbare blankets. There was no electricity in the cabin, so we used oil lamps to light the rooms. I didn't sleep well, though. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that scratching sound again, closer now, almost like it was inside the cabin, just on the other side of the walls. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping. It was a strange relief, the sound of life in the air after the oppressive silence of the night. Jason was already up, making coffee in the kitchen, and the sunlight streaming through the windows made the cabin look a little less gloomy. "Sleep okay?" he asked, handing me a cup of coffee. "Not really," I said, rubbing my eyes. "I kept hearing something last night, scratching, like something was outside the walls." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like the critters again. Don't worry about it. Happens all the time out here. You get used to it." I tried to brush it off, but the thought stuck with me. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't just an animal. But I didn't want to look like I was getting paranoid, so I kept quiet. The day passed in a blur of hiking through the woods and sitting around the cabin. But the strange feeling lingered in the back of my mind. The woods were too still, too quiet. We hadn't seen any wildlife besides a few birds and squirrels, and the air felt unnaturally thick, like something was pressing in on us. That evening, as we sat by the fire again, the scratching started once more. This time it was louder, closer. I stood up abruptly, my heart racing. "That's not normal. Jason, you hear that, right?" Jason looked at me like I was overreacting, but then his expression shifted. His gaze darted toward the window where the sound was coming from. It was a scraping like claws against the wood, but it was rhythmic, almost deliberate. "All right," Jason said, standing up. "Let's check it out." We both grabbed flashlights and headed outside. The temperature had dropped, and the wind whipped through the trees, making the branches sway ominously. The cabin was dark now, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The scratching sound was now coming from the side of the cabin. We walked toward it, the beam of our flashlights sweeping over the ground. At first, I didn't see anything, just the dense trees and the thick brush that surrounded the cabin. But then I noticed something. There were footprints, large, deep imprints in the soft earth, leading away from the cabin and into the trees. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The tracks weren't human. They were too wide, too strange, and they were fresh. "This isn't good," I muttered, taking a step back. Jason didn't respond. He was too busy staring at the trees, his face pale. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure. It was tall, its shape obscured by the trees, but I could make out the movement. It was walking slowly, deliberately, like it knew we were watching. Jason turned to me, his eyes wide. "We need to get inside. Now." We rushed back to the cabin, slamming the door behind us. I felt a sense of panic rise in my chest. We were being watched. There was no other explanation. And that figure, whatever it was still out there, just beyond the trees. For the rest of the night, we stayed huddled by the fire, listening to the sounds outside. The scratching had stopped, but something far worse had taken its place. Silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, makes you feel like you're being suffocated by it. We didn't sleep that night, not a single wink. The next morning, we packed up. Neither of us spoke much, but the unease between us was palpable. Jason was still trying to act like everything was fine, but I could tell he was rattled too. As we loaded up the truck, I noticed something strange in the dirt by the door. More tracks. This time, they were closer to the cabin, leading right up to the doorstep. And there was something else. A strange symbol scratched into the doorframe just below the handle. It looked like something ancient, something not human. Jason noticed it too, his eyes widening as he traced the symbol with his finger. "What the hell is that?" I didn't answer, couldn't. I had no idea what it was, but I knew we needed to get out of there. We didn't stay another minute. We got in the truck and drove off without looking back. As we passed through the hills, the sense of dread didn't fade. It clung to me like a shadow, something I couldn't shake. By the time we reached the nearest town, the sun was setting and the wind had picked up again, but I felt a small relief. The wilderness was behind us. Jason didn't speak for the rest of the drive. He kept looking out the window, lost in thought. When we finally pulled into town, he turned to me and said, "I don't know what that was, but whatever it wasn't just some animal." I nodded, unable to speak. The image of that figure, moving silently through the trees, was burned into my mind. We never went back to that cabin. Jason sold it a few months later, but I think he knew deep down that it wasn't just the cabin itself that was the problem. It was something in those woods, something older and darker than either of us could understand. And whatever it was still out there, waiting. The night was cold, a heavy chill that seemed to settle into your bones, even if you were wrapped up tight in layers of flannel and wool. I had been hunting all day, and I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on me. It was late October, the kind of time when the leaves on the trees had long turned shades of orange and brown. The kind of season when the sun dipped behind the horizon too early, leaving the forest in darkness by 6 o'clock. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves, rotting wood, and the faint scent of pine. I'd been hunting up in the Adirondacks for the past few days, hoping to bag a decent buck before the season ended. I had set up camp a couple of miles from the nearest road, a small cabin I had rented from a local outfitter. It was nothing fancy, just a simple log cabin with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. The perfect place for someone who just wanted to get away from it all. It was isolated, peaceful, and most importantly, it was far enough from other hunters to make it feel like I had the whole woods to myself. By the time I got back to the cabin that evening, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving a purple-black sky overhead. I pulled up to the cabin, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. I had to admit, the place looked peaceful, nestled in the valley between the mountains, with no lights or sounds around for miles except the wind rustling through the trees. It was getting late, and I had hoped to get a fire started before the temperature really started to drop. I didn't feel like sitting in the cold all night. As I stepped inside, I was hit with the familiar scent of wood and dust, a reminder of the cabin's solitude. I kicked off my boots, grabbed some firewood from the pile outside, and got the stove going. The heat spread quickly, filling the room with the comforting warmth I needed. I spent the next hour cleaning up, unpacking my gear, and preparing dinner. I didn't feel like hunting for more food tonight. The canned stew I had brought would do just fine. The warm meal settled nicely in my stomach, and as the fire crackled in the stove, I sat back in the worn chair by the window, looking out at the night. The wind outside had started to pick up, and with it came a soft tapping sound against the cabin's walls, like something or someone was moving around out there. It was probably just a branch scraping against the wood, but I still couldn't help but listen more closely. The tapping came again, a little louder this time, followed by a soft creak. I got up to check the windows. Nothing. The only movement outside was the flicker of shadows cast by the trees in the wind, and the eerie rustling of the underbrush. It was nothing unusual. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I shrugged it off and went back to my chair, throwing another log on the fire to keep the warmth going. I picked up my rifle, checking it over out of habit. It was a bolt-action, sturdy and reliable, the kind of rifle that could put down anything from a deer to a bear. It had been a while since I'd had a proper hunt, so the ritual of cleaning and checking the weapon felt good. The tapping on the walls returned again, but this time it seemed a little more insistent. I stood up, rifle in hand, and moved cautiously to the door. My heart was starting to race. Maybe it was nothing, but you don't spend years hunting in the woods without learning how to trust your instincts. And right now, those instincts were telling me something wasn't quite right. I pulled the door open a crack, the cold air biting at my face. There was no one in sight. The wind had died down a little, but the branches overhead were still swaying, casting long shadows over the ground. I scanned the area around the cabin, the darkness swallowing up everything beyond the porch light. That's when I saw it, a figure barely visible against the trees. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I had been in these woods enough to know that a person shouldn't be out here at this hour, especially not so close to the cabin. I was miles away from any real roads, and there were no signs of other hunters in the area. This was my spot, my alone time, and that person, or whatever it was too close to my camp for comfort. I closed the door quietly, keeping my eyes trained on the figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, still and unmoving, like it was waiting for something. I couldn't make out any details, just a vague shape outlined against the dark forest. But something about it, the way it stood there so unnaturally still, sent a chill through me. The tapping on the wall continued, but now it sounded like it was coming from the other side of the cabin, from the direction of the woods. Whoever or whatever was out there had made their way around the cabin. I couldn't just sit here and wait. I grabbed my rifle and moved toward the back door, keeping as quiet as I could. The shadows outside had thickened, and I couldn't see anything clearly anymore. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves, but that eerie tapping had stopped. It was as if the woods had gone completely silent. I stepped outside, the cold biting into my skin as I crept toward the back of the cabin, trying to keep myself hidden from view. I moved carefully, trying not to make a sound as I moved through the thick brush. My eyes scanned the darkness for any movement, but I couldn't see anything. Not a thing. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard a noise, soft but distinct, the sound of something moving through the leaves. It was coming from the other side of the cabin. I moved quickly, positioning myself so I could get a better look. My heartbeat was racing in my chest, and every nerve in my body was on high alert. The figure from before was gone now, but I wasn't about to take any chances. Then I heard something else, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill running up my spine. It was too low to be a human voice, but it wasn't an animal either. It was something in between, like the sound of something trying to sound like a person but failing horribly. I didn't wait around to find out what it was. I sprinted back to the cabin, slammed the door shut, and bolted it. My mind was racing, my thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. Who was out there? What did they want? And why did it feel like they were getting closer? The tapping started again, but now it was louder, more deliberate. I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't sure if I was dealing with another hunter, some drifter, or something else entirely, but my gut told me this wasn't just some random person passing through. The fire crackled in the stove, and I tried to focus on the warmth, on something that felt normal. But every time the tapping sounded again, it was like my heart skipped a beat. I knew they were out there, and I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The quiet outside had been replaced by something darker, something that didn't belong in these woods. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. My hands were shaking as I gripped the rifle tighter, the cold metal comforting in my hands. Every muscle in my body was tense, ready to react at the first sign of danger. Then, just as I was beginning to think maybe it was over, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Came from just outside the window. "Help me?" My blood ran cold. It was a woman's voice, thin and hoarse, barely audible over the wind. But I knew better than to trust a voice like that. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and I hadn't seen any signs of a car or footprints. Whoever was out there hadn't come in through the front. They had been circling the cabin the entire time, closing in. I couldn't take any chances. I gathered my gear, grabbed my rifle, and slipped out of the back door. I moved as quietly as I could, staying low to the ground, keeping to the shadows. The moon was now high in the sky, casting a pale light over the landscape, but it wasn't enough to reveal what was hidden in the darkness. I moved toward the woodshed, where I had left an axe earlier that day. It was the only weapon I could think of that might give me a fighting chance if things got ugly. My hands were shaking as I grabbed it, the heavy weight in my hands somehow more comforting than the rifle now. I moved through the trees, always aware of the distance between myself and whatever was out there. I didn't know if I was being hunted, if this was some kind of trap, or if it was all just in my head. But one thing was clear: I wasn't taking any chances. The night stretched on, but by morning, I had a plan. And when the light finally broke over the treetops, I wasn't there to see it. I had left the cabin behind and hiked out as quickly as I could, my mind too clouded with adrenaline to stop and think. When I reached the nearest road, I flagged down a passing car. I didn't look back. I didn't stay in those woods after that night, and I never went back to that cabin. Something about the way the trees had closed in on me, the way the tapping had felt like someone watching, made me realize I wasn't alone in that forest. And maybe, just maybe, there are some things in the woods better left undisturbed. The cabin remained empty, and for all I know, It still stands there to this day, alone in the woods. But I'll never forget the tapping or the voice outside the window. Some places are better left behind. The air was dense with the smell of pine and earth, thickened by the rainfall that had just subsided. I stood on the worn porch of the old cabin, my boots sinking into the soft, damp wood beneath me. The faintest traces of mist curled from the trees, wrapping themselves around the edges of the clearing, and the whole forest seemed to hold its breath in the cool, early evening air. It had been a long day. As a park ranger, I was used to long hours, but the solitude of this cabin in the middle of nowhere always made the days stretch even longer. This was my first shift at this remote outpost. The usual ranger station was too crowded, too close to the popular hiking trails. So, I had volunteered for this location, a small cabin tucked deep in the mountains, far away from the world. The peace was intoxicating at first, but now, with the night settling in and the storm clouds gathering once more, I wasn't so sure. I turned my attention back to the cabin. It was small, built decades ago by someone who had clearly wanted to be alone. The wood was weathered but sturdy, with thick beams that creaked in the wind. There was no electricity here, just a wood stove, a small oil lantern, and a gas-powered fridge. It was a minimalist paradise, or at least that's how I had seen it when I first arrived. Now, the stillness of the place felt oppressive. Every crack of the cabin settling in the quiet night sounded like something more, something unfamiliar. I'd been living here for 3 days now, and something had felt off since the moment I stepped foot inside. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint. It was more a creeping sense of unease, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. I tried to shake it off. I'd been trained for this, handling solitude, dealing with the wilderness. But the eerie quiet of the forest felt unnervingly unnatural. As the light began to fade, I locked the front door and started a fire in the stove. The flames crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, sending branches scraping across the roof with an unsettling screech. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and grabbed the lantern from the table, bringing it closer to the fire. It was still early enough that I had time to finish some paperwork, but there was something about tonight that made the job feel less like a routine task and more like a distraction. I didn't realize how long I had been staring at the fire when a loud bang shook the walls of the cabin. My heart jumped into my throat, and I froze, unsure of where the noise had come from. The wind? No, the noise had been too solid, too deliberate. Came from outside. I stood slowly, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, scanning the trees with a growing sense of dread. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still soft and wet, leaving deep footprints in the mud. I stepped closer to the edge of the clearing, my boots making a squelching sound with every step. At first, I thought it might be an animal. Perhaps a bear or a coyote had wandered close to the cabin, but the stillness that followed the noise was too complete. There was no movement, no rustling of the leaves, no distant hoot of an owl, just silence. I checked the surrounding area carefully, my eyes scanning the tree line, but nothing moved. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd on the ground. A set of fresh tracks. They were human tracks, but unlike any I'd seen before. The person, or whatever it was, had been walking barefoot through the mud, leaving deep impressions in the earth. The prints were uneven, almost as if they were dragging their feet, but there was no sign of struggle or injury. A chill ran down my spine as I followed the tracks with my flashlight. The tracks led away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. I hesitated for a moment, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. I could feel eyes on me, hidden somewhere between the trees, but I couldn't see anyone. My instincts were screaming at me to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for daylight, but something pulled me forward. I followed the trail for what felt like miles, my flashlight flickering in the growing darkness. The trees around me stood silent and oppressive, their branches like arms reaching down, threatening to close in. The further I walked, the more I felt the presence of something. The quiet was unnerving. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. Then I saw it, a shape in the distance, half hidden behind the thick trunks of the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was much too large. It stood still, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and I couldn't see its face through the dense fog that hung between us. It was more shadow than substance, an outline of something human but wrong. I stopped dead in my tracks. For a moment, I considered running back to the cabin, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, watching the figure that seemed to be watching me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the trees, vanishing without a trace. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I imagined it? Could it have been an animal? A hallucination brought on by the solitude and the stress of the job? I wasn't sure, but what I was sure of was that I had to go back to the cabin. Fast. I turned and made my way back, walking faster now, my steps hurried and uneven. The tracks I had been following seemed to have disappeared, as though they had been swallowed up by the earth itself. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It only grew stronger the closer I got to the cabin. When I finally reached the porch, my hands were shaking. I fumbled with the door, practically slamming it shut behind me. The fire was still burning, the shadows flickering across the walls, but everything else felt off. The stillness was back, but now it was different. Now it felt heavy, thick, like something was waiting just outside the door. I sat by the fire, trying to calm my racing heart, but sleep wouldn't come. The night dragged on, the minutes stretching into hours. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't belong in the woods. And then, as I sat there, staring into the fire, I heard it again. A faint tapping, like fingernails against the wood of the cabin. It started softly, almost imperceptible, but gradually it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the back of the cabin. I rose slowly, my heart pounding. The cabin seemed even smaller now, the walls closing in. I grabbed the flashlight once more, moving cautiously toward the back door. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie, unsettling silence. I swung the door open, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from before. But there was nothing, just the empty, mist-shrouded forest beyond. Except for one thing, a trail of wet footprints leading from the door, across the porch and out into the woods. My stomach twisted as I stared at them. The footprints were fresh, unmistakably human, and they were heading deeper into the forest, the same direction I had come from. I didn't hesitate this time. I grabbed my gear and locked the door behind me, determined to follow the trail, but this time, I wouldn't go as far. I would keep my distance, keep my wits about me. As I ventured out, I noticed something that sent a cold shiver through my spine. There was no longer any sound in the woods. Not the rustle of leaves, not the call of any animal, not even the distant hum of insects. There was only the crunch of my boots on the wet earth and the sound of my own breath. I followed the footprints, moving faster now, my flashlight sweeping across the trees, looking for any sign of movement. And then, just as the trail seemed to disappear into a dense thicket, I heard it. A sound low, guttural, like something or someone exhaling heavily in the darkness. I froze, my heart racing. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped into the light. It wasn't the tall shape I had seen earlier, but a man, haggard and thin, his face gaunt with exhaustion. He looked as though he had been lost in the woods for weeks. His clothes were torn, his hair matted with dirt, and his eyes, those eyes were wild, almost feral. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze intense, before he turned and disappeared back into the trees, his footsteps barely making a sound as he vanished into the night. I stood there, unable to move, my mind racing. Who was he? What was he doing out here? I couldn't stay out here any longer. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my legs aching with the effort, my mind racing with the implications of what I had seen. I slammed the door shut behind me, bolting it this time, and sank to the floor, gasping for air. I wasn't alone in these woods, and whoever that man was, he wasn't the only one out there. That night, I didn't sleep at all. By morning, the silence had returned, but it was no longer the comfortable silence of nature. It was an oppressive, suffocating silence, one that felt wrong. I packed up my things and left the cabin that day, abandoning my post. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never return to that cabin again. And to this day, I wonder how many others have heard that same tapping, followed those same footprints, and seen the shadowy figures moving through the trees. Some things are better left unexplored. It was October 2021 when I decided to take some time off and disappear into the mountains for a while. I was 33 then, single, no kids, and working remotely in cybersecurity. After spending most of the year staring at a screen in my apartment in Pittsburgh, I felt like I was losing my grip on things. I needed space, real space, not the kind where you take a long walk in the city and still hear traffic. I wanted trees, wind, maybe even some cold. I started looking online for remote cabins to rent and stumbled on a listing with almost no photos, no reviews, and a short description that just said, secluded cabin, graveyard nearby, power, water, with stove. That was it. The cabin was in West Virginia, near a small place called Glenville, way off the main roads. I figured that the graveyard mention was just part of the landscape down there. Tons of old family plots scattered around rural land. I wasn't worried. The price was cheap, and I wasn't planning on leaving the cabin much anyway. I booked it for 2 weeks. When I drove down, it took longer than expected. I left before sunrise, and by the time I pulled off the paved roads and onto the gravel path that led toward the property, the sun was already dipping low. I remember passing a rusted gate and an old mailbox leaning sideways, the numbers on it completely worn off. I drove past a few empty fields, then through some dense woods. That gravel path wound up a hill and finally opened to a clearing where the cabin sat. The place looked smaller than I expected, with siding stained dark brown, the roof covered in old greenish shingles. There was a chimney built from uneven stones and a small porch that creaked when I stepped on it. Next to the cabin, about 30 yards away, was the graveyard. I could see it clearly from the front porch. There were maybe a dozen headstones, some standing straight, others leaning at odd angles. No fence around it, just high grass and a couple of leafless trees towering over the stones. It creeped me out a little at first, but I told myself it was just because I'd gotten there so late. I unloaded my gear, sleeping bag, camping stove, some canned food, a cooler of frozen meals, my laptop, portable solar panel, a thick flashlight, a heavy-duty knife, and a Ruger .38 I kept in my car for emergencies. The cabin did have power like the listing said, but it was off-grid, solar-powered with a propane backup generator. There was running water from a nearby spring, and the place had a compost toilet and a rain barrel outside. Basic, but manageable. Inside, the cabin had one main room with a cot, a table and 2 chairs, a small kitchenette, and a cast iron stove. Everything smelled like cedar and old dust. I built a quick fire in the stove, cooked some rice and beans on the portable burner, and sat on the porch with my jacket zipped to my chin. The air was crisp and dead quiet. Too quiet. No bugs, no birds, nothing. I tried not to look at the graveyard, but my eyes kept drifting to it. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The cot was stiff and squeaky, and the wind kept brushing branches against the cabin. Around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like footsteps outside, slow ones. I sat up, heart thumping, and listened hard. They stopped. I held my breath for a while, staring at the door, then got up and looked out the window. Nothing, just the moonlight stretching shadows from the headstones. I told myself it was probably a deer. There were prints near the porch in the morning, but they were too scuffed up to be sure. By the third day, I'd mostly settled in. I'd work for a few hours on my laptop in the morning, then take short walks in the woods or read on the porch. I avoided the graveyard, though. I didn't even walk near it. The stones were too weathered to read most of the names, but a couple were marked with dates from the 1800s. No flowers, no signs of anyone visiting. It was on the fifth night that something really started to feel wrong. I'd gone to bed around 10, and sometime before midnight I woke up to a strange tapping sound. Not loud, but rhythmic, like someone knocking lightly on wood. It wasn't the wind. I could tell the difference now. I grabbed my flashlight, got out of bed, and listened. The tapping came again, not at the door, on the back wall of the cabin. I moved slowly, my socks silent on the wood floor. The flashlight beam shook slightly in my hand as I stepped toward the back window. I flicked it on and aimed it outside. Nothing. The beam caught only trees and grass. I opened the door quietly and stepped out, shining the light around the back of the cabin. No one, no animals, but in the dirt near the wall, I saw what looked like a partial footprint. Barefoot. Not huge, not small either, and the toes were clearly visible in the soft soil. I stared at it for a long time, then slowly backed inside. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and kept the flashlight and gun on the table next to my bed. The next morning, I walked a wide circle around the graveyard and cabin, looking for any more prints. I found 2 more, one near the big tree behind the graves, and another along the edge of the woods. Both were barefoot. There were no other signs of anyone being there. No litter, no clothing, no food wrappers. Nothing. I kept trying to tell myself it could be a squatter, maybe someone camping nearby who wandered onto the property. But the prints didn't lead anywhere. They just appeared in the dirt like someone had stepped there and vanished. I stayed close to the cabin that day. I didn't work, didn't eat much either. Every creak of the wood or gust of wind made my skin crawl. I checked the door and windows again and again. That night, I stayed up with the lights off, sitting in a chair by the window with my flashlight and gun on my lap. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement. A figure was walking from the edge of the woods, slow and steady, right toward the graveyard. It was a man. No shirt, pants so dark they were almost black. Barefoot. He didn't have a light, didn't stumble, didn't look around. He just walked straight through the graveyard, stopped in the middle of it, and stood there. I froze. I didn't breathe. I didn't move the flashlight. He didn't do anything. Just stood still for maybe 5 minutes. Then he turned and walked back the way he came, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to make sense of it. Why was he barefoot? Why the graveyard? I had no cell signal and the satellite internet was too weak for video calls. I thought about leaving the next morning, but something in me said not yet. Maybe I didn't want to admit that I was scared. Maybe I thought it would stop, but it didn't. The next night he came back. Same time, same way. Walked to the graveyard, stood in the center, then left. I watched him through the narrow crack in the curtains. My hands were clenched so hard they cramped. I started making noise during the day. playing music on my laptop, shouting random things outside, hammering a stick against a tree. I thought maybe if whoever it was realized I was watching, they'd stop. But they didn't. On the 9th night, it changed. I was in the cabin, lights off, same chair, same spot. 2:45 a.m. I saw movement again. The figure walked to the graveyard like before, but this time he didn't stop in the middle. He kept walking toward the cabin. Couldn't breathe. He came all the way up to the porch. I could hear the wood creak. I heard him breathing, slow and wet, like he had something in his lungs. He didn't knock, didn't try the door, just stood there. I held the gun in both hands, arms locked straight, heart beating so loud I thought it would burst. Then he walked away, just turned around and left. In the morning, I found a handprint on the window next to the door. It was smudged with dirt and blood. The fingers were long, the palm wide. I packed my things that hour, loaded everything into my car, and took off down that gravel road like the devil was behind me. I didn't care about the rental agreement, didn't care about the food I left. I just wanted to get out. I reported it to the local sheriff's department in Glenville. The deputy I spoke to was polite but didn't seem too interested. Said there were transients in the area sometimes. Old hermits who lived in the woods and didn't like visitors. Told me I probably scared him off. That was it. I drove back to Pittsburgh that night and didn't sleep for 2 days. I kept thinking about how quiet he was, how he never spoke, never showed his face. I didn't see his eyes, didn't hear his voice. Just slow footsteps, long silences, and that smudged handprint on the glass. I never went back. The listing disappeared from the site a few weeks later. I checked on it obsessively for a while, but it was just gone. No trace of the owner, no phone number. It was like the place had never been rented at all. But it was real. I remember the rough feel of the cabin walls, the chill in the graveyard air, the sound of that breathing just outside my door. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night in my apartment, I swear I hear footsteps on the hardwood outside my bedroom. But I never check anymore. I don't want to know. I had been training hard the last few months. Nothing fancy, just regular gym stuff, a strict routine, and a diet that kept me focused. I wasn't trying to become a bodybuilder or anything like that, but I did want to feel strong, like I could rely on my own body. That's how I got close with Dylan. He was a regular at the gym, about the same age as me. Mid-30s, quiet but easygoing, someone I could lift with and not have to make small talk all the time. We eventually started spotting each other during heavier lifts, and before long we were meeting up outside the gym too, going for early morning runs, the occasional hike, stuff like that. The idea for the cabin trip came out of nowhere. It was early spring, still cold in the mornings, but the kind of weather that made you want to be outdoors. Dylan told me his cousin had a small cabin up north, deep in the forest, near a place called Belridge, a forgotten town in northern Oregon. The cabin was old but functional, with running water, a wood-burning stove, and a generator that could be turned on if needed. The plan was simple. Drive up Friday morning, stay until Sunday afternoon, disconnect from everything, cook clean meals, hike, and just relax. That was the idea, at least. We left early on a Friday. It was April 2023. The drive was peaceful. Long stretches of open highway, quiet towns we passed through that looked like they hadn't changed in decades. By the time we reached the forest road that would take us to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the tall pines. Dylan was driving. He knew the area better than me, said he had been to the cabin once before with his cousin about 5 years ago. The last few miles were rough, dirt roads full of ruts and potholes. We were in Dylan's truck, so it handled fine, but it still shook us up a bit. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. There was no cell service, which we expected, and no neighbors within walking distance. The place looked like something out of a hunting magazine. Simple wooden walls, a tin roof, and a small front porch with a couple of old chairs. There was a shed nearby and an old fire pit with a few stacked logs. Inside, it was rustic but clean. 2 small bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a heavy old stove and a few mismatched chairs. The windows were dusty but intact, and the place didn't smell like mice or mold, which was a win in my book. We spent that first evening settling in, unpacked the gear, got the generator running for a bit to test it, then shut it off and switched to battery lanterns. Cooked some chicken and rice over a propane stove, drank a couple of protein shakes, and just sat around enjoying the quiet. I don't remember us talking much, we didn't need to. After dinner, we took a short walk around the area, not straying too far from the cabin since it was already getting dark. The forest was quiet in that heavy way, like it was holding its breath. We turned in early. Saturday morning, we woke up before the sun, made instant coffee, did a short bodyweight workout on the porch, and then headed out for a hike. There were no marked trails, so we followed deer paths and small game trails, checking our direction with a compass and Dylan's old GPS watch. We went for hours, winding deeper into the trees, climbing over fallen logs and skirting around marshy spots where the ground sucked at our boots. We didn't talk much, just kept a steady pace, pausing now and then to drink water and scan the woods. We saw a couple of deer, and once we heard something big moving through the brush ahead of us. Too big to be a squirrel, but we never saw it. By late afternoon, we were back at the cabin. We were dirty, tired, and hungry, but it was the good kind of tired. We cleaned up, cooked more food, beef this time, with potatoes and carrots from a can, and then sat outside while the sun went down. It got cold fast. We threw on jackets and lit a fire in the pit. The wood was dry and caught quickly. We sat there for a while, watching the flames, listening to the forest. At some point, I went inside to grab something and noticed one of the kitchen drawers was open. I didn't think much of it. Figured we must have left it like that when unpacking, or maybe the drawer was loose and slid open. I pushed it shut and went back outside. A little later, I noticed the shed door was cracked open. Again, nothing too weird, maybe the wind. I went and closed it, latched it this time, and came back to the fire. We stayed up a bit longer, then put out the fire, locked up, and went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise, something soft like a shuffle or scrape. I stayed still, listening. The cabin was dark and dead quiet, except for the soft creak of the wood contracting from the cold. I didn't hear anything else. Figured it was just the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the roof. I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but I felt it in my gut. When I stepped outside, I saw it right away, tracks. Not animal tracks, boot prints, fresh ones, coming up from the trees on the far side of the clearing, stopping just a few feet from the porch. They weren't ours. They were different, larger, deeper, and leading nowhere else. Just a straight line from the forest to the cabin, and then gone. I showed Dylan. He didn't say anything, just stared at them for a while. Then he walked the perimeter of the clearing, scanning the tree-line. We checked the shed, it was still latched. Then we went inside and checked the cabin. Nothing missing, nothing moved, just those prints outside. The air felt heavier after that, like the forest was watching us. We decided to stick close to the cabin that day. We did a short hike around the nearby hills, circling the area but not going far. Every so often, we stopped and listened. The forest felt different now, not silent but muffled, like it was holding something back. We didn't say it, but we both felt it. That night, we kept the generator running a little longer, lit more lanterns inside, and brought the axes in, just in case. We locked everything again. I pushed one of the heavy chairs against the front door. It made me feel a little better, even if it didn't mean much. I didn't sleep well. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up thinking I heard something. A creak, a thump, a whisper of movement. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside, slow, careful, like someone was trying not to be heard. I froze. The sound moved around the side of the cabin, then stopped. A few seconds later, I heard it again on the other side. I stayed perfectly still. No light, no noise, just my own breathing and the sound of my heart pounding. Eventually, it stopped. I waited a long time before I even moved. When the sun started to rise, I finally got up. Dylan was already awake. He looked like he hadn't slept either. We didn't need to say anything. We were leaving. We packed fast. Didn't eat, didn't clean up. Just stuffed everything into the bags and loaded the truck. Before we left, I walked around to the side of the cabin. More boot prints. This time they went all the way around. Someone had been circling the place. We drove out in silence. Neither of us relaxed until we were back on the highway with bars on our phones. I checked the cabin camera Dylan had set up inside without telling me. Just a small trail camera he placed above the door, pointing toward the living room. The last night, it caught something. A figure, tall, wearing a hood, standing just outside the front window, still as a statue, just watching. It stood there for 10 minutes, not moving. Then it walked out of frame. That was it. We never reported it. What would we even say? No break-in, no damage, no theft. Just a feeling. Just boot prints in the dirt and someone watching us. We never went back to that cabin. I kept going to the gym. Dylan moved away a few months later for a job. We still message now and then, but we don't talk about that weekend. I think about it more than I admit. The way the air changed, the feeling of being watched, the silence that pressed against your ears like water. Sometimes I wonder how long he was watching us. Not just that night, but the whole weekend. Maybe the tracks were only the ones we saw. Maybe he had been there the entire time, just out of sight. Whatever his reason, he didn't break in. He didn't attack. He didn't do anything at all except watch. And that's the part that stays with me, because I don't think he was waiting for us to leave. I think he was waiting for us to stay. I was 32 when I decided to take some time off and spend a long weekend alone in a cabin up in northern Michigan. This was back in late September of 2019, right before the leaves started to change color. I had a remote job back then, and even though I could technically work from anywhere, I needed to unplug for a few days. I'd been working long hours, barely sleeping, eating junk, and generally feeling burnt out. So I figured a few quiet days alone in the woods might help clear my head. The cabin belonged to a friend's uncle. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden structure tucked into the edge of a dense forest, about half a mile off a dirt road and maybe 30 minutes from the nearest town. No Wi-Fi, no TV, not even much cell service. Just me, a few books, and whatever I brought with me. That sounded perfect at the time. I drove up on a Thursday morning, packed light, a cooler with food and water, a duffel bag with clothes, a flashlight, a hunting knife, a few paperbacks, and a sleeping bag. The cabin had a wood stove, a generator for a bit of electricity, and a rain barrel for washing up. Nothing more than what I needed. When I got there, everything looked fine. The door was locked, windows unbroken, and the area around the cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. I walked around the place, stretched my legs, and checked out the woods for a bit. It was peaceful. Birds chirping, wind rustling through the trees, the faint scent of pine and damp earth in the air. No one around for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. The first day went by quietly. I read for a while on the small porch, fixed myself some canned chili, and watched the sun go down. The night was colder than I expected, so I built a fire inside using some logs stacked beside the stove. I wasn't used to absolute silence. Took some getting used to. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the creaking of the cabin walls settling. I slept hard that night, woke up a little after sunrise, made instant coffee over the propane burner and sat outside for a while, just staring out into the trees. There was no trail, just thick brush and woods in every direction. I wasn't much of a hiker, but I wandered a bit, maybe 100 yards in one direction, just to get a feel for the place. Found some deer tracks, a few rabbit droppings, nothing unusual, still peaceful. But that afternoon, something felt a little off. Not scary exactly, just strange. I was sitting out front, drinking water and flipping through a paperback, when I noticed something in the trees about 40 feet out. It wasn't big, just a small strip of color where there shouldn't have been any, like fabric. I walked over and found a torn piece of blue plastic, like a grocery bag, caught on a low branch. I figured the wind had blown it in, though I hadn't seen any trash earlier. I took it off and pocketed it. Not a big deal. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Not because of noise, because of how quiet it was. So quiet that every little creak and pop from the cabin sounded sharp, almost loud. I started to notice the rhythm of the sounds, and that's when it got to me. There was something outside. I'm not talking about a bear or a raccoon or anything like that. I didn't hear any grunting, growling, or animal movement. What I heard sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps in the leaves, shuffling, then stopping, waiting, then a few more steps. They didn't circle the cabin. They stayed on one side, maybe 20 feet out, just far enough that I couldn't see from the windows unless I stepped out onto the porch. I sat there on the mattress, clutching the knife I'd brought, staring out the front window for what must have been 2 hours. I didn't dare turn on the lights or the generator. I just waited. At some point, the sound stopped. I waited another half hour, maybe more, before I finally dozed off from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I looked for tracks. The ground was mostly dry pine needles and leaves, but I did find what looked like a partial shoe print in the dirt off to the side. Not big, maybe size 10, same as me. Definitely not an animal. I looked around more but didn't see anything else. No wrappers, no gear, no sign someone had been camping nearby. It was like someone had just walked into the woods, stood around near my cabin for a while, then left. I told myself it might have been a hunter, but it didn't sit right. It was private property, and there were signs posted out by the road. Whoever it was had no reason to be there, and they hadn't knocked or announced themselves, just walked around quietly. I stayed closer to the cabin that day. Every now and then, I thought I heard something out in the trees. A crack, a thud, a sound that wasn't wind. But I didn't see anything. Still, I felt watched. It was the kind of unease that starts in your stomach and spreads until you're checking over your shoulder every few minutes. That afternoon, I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't go out again until morning. That night, it rained. Light at first, then heavier around midnight. The sound of it on the tin roof was constant, but I still thought I heard movement. Not footsteps this time, more like scratching or dragging. It was hard to tell with the rain. I barely slept. When I woke up, the rain had stopped and everything was soaked. I walked the perimeter of the cabin again and found something I hadn't noticed before. A long, shallow mark in the dirt near the rear window. It looked like something had been dragged. A branch maybe, or a stick. But there weren't any fallen branches nearby. It just started at the edge of the woods and ended at the wall of the cabin. I felt sick when I saw it. The next couple of hours were a blur. I packed up my bag and made a decision to leave. I didn't care that I'd planned to stay another day. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I walked down the trail toward where I'd parked my car at the bottom of the hill, but the car was gone. First, I thought maybe I was in the wrong spot. I circled around, checked the road, even walked further up in case I'd gotten turned around. But no, the car was gone. No tire tracks in the mud from someone else. Just gone. I stood there for a long time trying to figure out what to do. I didn't have cell service. The nearest house I knew of was maybe 5 or 6 miles down the road. I could walk it, but if whoever was messing with me was still around, that was a risk. So I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and waited. By now, my heart was racing constantly. Every noise made me jump. I kept the knife on me at all times. Every hour, I checked the windows. Nothing. Just trees and fog and the sound of dripping water from the roof. Then, around 5 p.m., I saw something across the clearing. Something new. Someone had tied a long piece of string to a tree, maybe 40 feet out. It hadn't been there before. A thin white string, stretched low to the ground, barely visible unless you were looking directly at it. I followed it with my eyes as far as I could into the trees, but it disappeared into the brush. My chest tightened. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of the cabin with my back against the wall and the knife in my hand, listening to every sound. And there were sounds. More footsteps. A knock, one single knock on the side wall near the back. Not hard, just enough to let me know they were still there. But they never tried to get in. That was the worst part. They didn't break in, didn't yell, didn't make demands. Just let me know they were there, watching, waiting. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I was going to walk to the nearest house or main road and flag down a car. I wasn't staying another hour. I grabbed what I could carry, left everything else behind, and took off down the road.
Ival kiet fast.
Kept checking behind me. Every snap of a twig or rustle of a bush made me whip around. But no one followed, at least not where I could see them. After about 2 hours of walking, I finally saw a mailbox up ahead. A ranch-style house with a satellite dish and a pickup truck in the driveway. I walked up and knocked hard on the door. An older man answered, gave me a strange look, and let me use his phone. I called a tow company first, told them where I'd left my car. They said they'd send someone out. I waited on the porch while the man made me coffee. I didn't say much, just that something weird had happened and I needed to get back to town. The tow truck showed up an hour later. The driver radioed in and then told me something that froze my blood. They'd found my car. It was on the opposite side of the county, abandoned near a trailhead I'd never even heard of. Keys gone. Everything inside untouched. Even the cash I'd left in the glove box. No sign of who moved it. No prints, no damage. It was like someone had just driven it there and left it. The sheriff's department took a report, but nothing ever came of it. They said maybe it was kids messing around. Maybe I left the keys in it by accident and someone took a joyride. But I know I didn't. I had the keys with me the entire time. I never went back to that cabin. I never saw whoever it was that had been out there watching me. I don't know what they wanted. Maybe it was just to scare me. Maybe it could have been worse if I'd stayed one more night. But I left with a clear understanding of something I hadn't believed before. The woods aren't empty, and sometimes someone is already out there waiting. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a person with all the time in the world and no reason to stop. I sold my car 3 weeks later. I couldn't even look at it without getting that sick feeling in my chest again. And I haven't been camping since. I was 32 when I decided to take a break from the city. I'd been living in Atlanta for most of my adult life, working in insurance, doing the same thing every day behind a desk. The noise, the traffic, the endless emails. It all started grinding me down. So in the spring of 2019, I took 2 weeks off and booked a cabin up in Tennessee, not far from the Smoky Mountains. The cabin was in a remote part of the woods, about 40 minutes from a small town called Newport. It was listed on some site that advertised off-grid getaways. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just a generator, a water pump, and nature. That's exactly what I wanted. Peace and quiet. I rented a pickup from the airport, packed up some supplies. Canned food, bottled water, propane for the small stove, a few books, a tarp, and a toolkit, and made my way there. The last part of the drive was up a winding dirt road that barely looked used. It had rained a few days before I arrived, so the road was muddy, rutted in places. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck as I crawled along. The GPS had lost its signal about 20 minutes earlier. I was using printed directions from the rental listing, which told me to look for a broken fence post and an old rusted mailbox. When I finally found it, I turned down the barely visible path and saw the cabin ahead, tucked into the trees. It looked exactly like the pictures. Single story, dark wood, front porch with a couple chairs, small shed off to the side. There was a fire pit in front, a pile of chopped wood stacked nearby. The place was quiet, peaceful. I unpacked everything, set it up inside, and got the generator running before dark. I lit a few lanterns, ate some chili from a can, and sat on the porch, listening to the forest. That first night, I slept like a rock. No sirens, no headlights flickering past the window, no loud neighbors. Just frogs and wind and the occasional creak of the trees. The mattress was old, but it didn't matter. I woke up early the next morning to a thick fog over the trees and cool air on my face. I made some coffee on the propane burner and sat outside, watching the sun slowly burn through the mist. For the first couple days, it was perfect. I read, hiked a little, chopped some firewood, kept a journal. I even tried sketching the trees, though I've never been much of an artist. I stayed close to the cabin most of the time. I'd always liked the idea of being in the woods alone, though I'd never actually done it for more than a night or two. I liked the silence. It let my mind breathe. But around the fourth day, I noticed something strange. I was out behind the cabin, maybe 100 yards into the woods, checking out this small creek I'd come across the day before. It wasn't much, just a trickle over some rocks, but it was a nice spot to sit and listen. I'd brought a little camp stool and a thermos of coffee. As I sat there, I noticed something in the mud across the creek. It looked like boot prints, big ones, deep, like whoever made them was heavy or carrying something. They weren't mine. I'd never crossed to the other side. I walked along the edge of the creek, looking for more, and sure enough, I found a trail of them leading off into the woods. That struck me as odd. The cabin was supposed to be on private property. There weren't any other rentals nearby, no hiking trails. The listing had mentioned the land around the cabin was owned by the same family who built it decades ago. I hadn't seen another person since I got there. No cars, no lights through the trees at night, just animals. I stood there for a while, staring at those prints. Then I walked back to the cabin and tried to forget about it. But that night, I didn't sleep as well. Every noise outside made me tense up. A branch snapping, something rustling through leaves. I kept telling myself it was probably just a hunter, or maybe someone from town who didn't realize the land was private. But the prints had looked fresh. No rain, no leaves over them. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. Didn't see anything unusual. No more prints. The wood pile hadn't been touched. The shed was still locked. But when I walked out to the truck, I saw something weird. One of the tires was low. Not flat, but definitely lower than the others. I checked it with the little gauge I had. It had lost almost half the air. I'd inspected everything when I got there. The tires were fine. I didn't remember hitting anything on the way up. I got out the air compressor and filled it back up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That afternoon, I stayed closer to the cabin. Read a little, but couldn't focus. Every so often, I'd walk around the property, checking the tree line. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't ignore how quiet everything felt. The birds were still there, but there was this pressure in the air like before a storm. That night, I turned off the generator early and lit a few candles. I figured maybe the light was drawing attention. I even covered the windows with some old sheets I found in the closet. I still had 3 days left before I planned to head back, but I was already thinking about cutting it short. Around midnight, I heard something. It was soft at first, just a thump, then another, then the creak of the porch boards. I froze in bed. I hadn't had a single visitor in 5 days. I'd barely seen a bird land near the porch, but I was sure someone was out there. I sat up, slowly, careful not to make any noise. My flashlight was on the nightstand, but I didn't grab it. I just listened. Another creak. Then something knocked against the door. Not hard, more like a bump, like someone leaning into it. My heart was pounding. I remembered the small axe I kept by the stove. I crept out of bed, stepped lightly through the dark room, and picked it up. I waited there, by the wall, holding my breath. Nothing happened. After a minute, I peeked out the window, pulling the sheet back just a little. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. No moon, no stars. The generator was off. I waited there, staring into the dark for a long time. Then I heard footsteps, moving away, crunching over the leaves. Whoever it was, they didn't run. They just walked off, slow and steady, like they weren't in a hurry. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the chair with the axe in my lap, watching the door, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally came up, I went outside. There were marks on the porch, mud, and a scuffed spot near the door like something heavy had pressed into it. I walked the perimeter of the cabin. That's when I found something that made my stomach turn. Out near the woodpile, someone had stuck a stick into the ground. On top of it was a plastic water bottle. My water bottle. I'd left it in the truck. The cap was twisted off and balanced on top. Felt like a message, but I didn't know what it meant. I checked the truck. One of the back doors was ajar. I always lock everything. I was sure I had. Inside, it looked like someone had gone through my bags. Nothing was missing, but things were out of place. Pair of socks on the seat. My shaving kit on the floor. That was it. I packed up as fast as I could. Tossed everything into the truck. Turned the key. Started, but I was sweating the whole time. I didn't look back at the cabin as I pulled out. I just drove. The road was worse than before. Muddy, slick. I had to take it slow, which made it worse. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step into the road. But I didn't. Just trees. Took me over an hour to get back to town. I stopped at the first gas station I saw. I used their bathroom to splash cold water on my face, then sat in the truck with the engine running for a while. I thought about calling the property owner, but what would I say? That someone walked on the porch? That they left a water bottle on a stick? I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I didn't tell anyone about what happened until weeks later. When I did, they said maybe it was just a squatter or some drifter living in the woods. Maybe a prank. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like whoever it was had been watching. Like they knew I was alone. Like they were testing me. I haven't been back to a cabin since. I still think about that night. The creaking boards. The soft knock on the door. The slow footsteps fading into the trees. And that feeling, that deep, pressing weight in the air, that someone was watching me the whole time. Sometimes, when I wake up at night in my apartment, I swear I hear that same creak. But I tell myself it's nothing, just an old building settling. Still, I check the door, just in case. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to spend a full week off the grid. I had just turned 34. My name's Andrew, and I had been living in Las Cruces, New Mexico, working long hours at a custom metal fabrication shop. The work was loud, dusty, and repetitive. I had grown tired of the constant buzz of machines and the same old daily grind. I didn't want a beach or a city vacation. I wanted quiet, silence, isolation. I had heard about this remote cabin up near the edge of the Carson National Forest from a coworker named Travis. He'd stayed there once during hunting season. Said it was bare bones, no internet, no cell signal, no neighbors for miles, and best of all, cheap. The owners were an older couple who lived in town, and they mostly rented it to people who wanted solitude. I thought it sounded perfect. I booked it for 7 days. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just my younger sister, and even she only had the general area. It was the kind of place where GPS lost its signal halfway in. I printed out directions, packed my gear, and headed out early one Saturday morning in July. The first leg of the trip was smooth. I stopped for gas and supplies in Espanola. I bought canned food, a small cooler of fresh items, some dry snacks, and bottled water. I wasn't expecting luxury, just a chance to sit in the woods and read, maybe write, hike a little. I brought a sleeping bag, flashlight, a small hatchet, a folding knife, and a first aid kit. I had no guns, not because I'm against them, but because I didn't think I'd need one. The last 45 minutes of the drive were rough. I followed the directions off the paved road, then onto a long, narrow dirt path that climbed up through scrub and pine. The higher I went, the more rugged it got. I drove slow, avoiding ruts and rocks. Dust billowed up in my rear view. My rental SUV bounced around a bit, but it made it. I knew I was close when I saw an old wooden fence line on the right, broken in a few spots. Beyond that was forest, dense and wild. Then I spotted the clearing, and the cabin came into view. It was small and weathered, with faded red paint and a metal roof. A single chimney poked up from the side. There was a small porch with a worn wooden chair and a metal bucket full of kindling. A solar panel sat on a tripod next to the shed, probably enough to power a light or two. A 55-gallon drum was rigged up for rainwater, though it looked almost empty. There was no visible driveway, just packed dirt and grass from the last person's tires. I parked to the side, killed the engine, and stepped out. It was dead quiet. The only sound was the wind pushing through the trees and a few insects buzzing around. I unlocked the front door with the key they'd mailed me. Inside was even simpler than I expected. One main room, a small cast iron stove for heat, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a counter with some shelves above it, and a narrow bed against the far wall. There was a dry toilet out back in a separate little shack. No running water. A couple of old kerosene lamps sat on the table. The air inside smelled like old wood, dust, and earth. It was exactly what I needed. The first 2 days were peaceful. I woke up early, made simple breakfasts, oatmeal, eggs on a camp stove, coffee from a metal percolator. I spent most of my time outside, sitting in a camp chair with a book, or hiking down some of the unmarked game trails that weaved through the trees. I brought a small journal and wrote for a couple hours each day. The nights were cold but calm. I'd light the stove, wrap up in a blanket, and listen to the wind outside. The silence was so deep it almost pressed in on you. I thought I'd be scared being so far from anyone, but it was peaceful, at least at first. The third night, something changed. It started with the sound of footsteps outside. I was already in bed, half asleep, when I heard them. Soft crunches in the dirt and dry pine needles, moving around the back of the cabin. I lay still, thinking maybe it was a deer, but the steps didn't sound like hooves. They were slow, heavy, deliberate, human. I stayed in bed, not moving, heart starting to race. The footsteps stopped for a long while. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. I didn't see anyone, but in the loose dirt near the back wall, I found what looked like the faint outline of a boot print. Not mine. I had been wearing trail runners, and this was a thick, deeper tread. I felt uneasy, but I told myself it could have been from days ago. Maybe a hiker, a hunter, who knew? The place wasn't fenced off. Still, from then on, I kept a closer eye on things. I started locking the door, even when I was inside. I kept my folding knife next to my bed, and I stopped hiking far from the cabin. On the fourth day, things escalated. It was early evening. I was sitting on the porch watching the trees sway when I saw something move behind them. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I realized it was a person. A man, maybe 50 yards out, partially obscured by the tree trunks. He was standing still, just watching.
No pack, no visible gear.
Just standing there. I froze. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make noise. After about 20 seconds, he slowly stepped behind one of the trees and disappeared from view. I waited another 5 minutes, then went inside and locked the door. I stayed up most of that night, straining to hear any sounds outside. I kept the kerosene lamp off, just sat there in the dark, trying to control my breathing. Nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I went out again and looked around. I didn't see anyone, but off to the side of the clearing, maybe 10 feet into the woods, I found something strange. A used matchstick sticking out of the ground, half burnt, like someone had struck it and stuck it in the dirt. It wasn't mine. I hadn't lit any matches out there. I felt like something was wrong, really wrong. I thought about leaving early, but the idea of driving that narrow dirt road at night, with limited visibility and no phone signal, didn't seem much better. I stayed one more night. That was my mistake. On the 6th night, everything came to a head. It was around 11 p.m. I had been trying to sleep, bundled in my bag, knife still in my hand. The wind had picked up, and the old roof creaked above me. Then I heard it again. Footsteps outside. Slow. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Closer. Then a light, very faint, like a flashlight beam, filtered through the trees. It moved toward the cabin from the side, sweeping slowly. I saw the shadow pass by the window, tall and thin. I got up as quietly as I could, crept to the table, and turned the kerosene lamp wick down low until it was barely aglow. I waited. The footsteps moved around to the back again, paused, then came back toward the front door. And then they stopped. I didn't breathe. I stood still, heart pounding. Suddenly, the door rattled. Not a knock, a sharp, testing push. A little harder, then again. I had locked it, and the deadbolt held. I stood there, gripping my knife, sweat running down my back despite the cold. The door creaked like someone was putting weight on it, testing how strong it was. Then nothing. Silence. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. I waited, heart hammering in my ears, until the first light of dawn finally crept through the window. I stepped outside, slow, cautious, scanning every corner of the woods. Whoever it was, they were gone. But in the dirt in front of the porch, I found something new. A small pile of pebbles, neatly arranged. 5 little stones stacked on top of each other, like a marker. That was enough for me. I packed my gear in 10 minutes, didn't eat, didn't make coffee. Just grabbed my keys and drove. The SUV fishtailed once on a curve, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down until I hit paved road again. When I got back to town, I drove straight to the little hardware shop where the cabin owners worked. I told them someone had been stalking the place, watching me, trying to get in. They looked surprised, but not shocked. The man, Ray, I think, said something about off-season squatters and how sometimes people hid out in those woods. Said he'd go up and check it out. I never found out who the man was. I didn't go back. I didn't call the police. What could I even tell them? There was no crime, technically. No one got hurt. Nothing was stolen. Just fear. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise made me flinch. I kept thinking about how long that guy had been watching. Had he followed me from the road? Was he already up there when I arrived? I don't know. What I do know is this. Being alone in the woods sounds peaceful, but it only feels safe when you're truly alone. The second you realize someone else is out there, watching from the trees, everything changes. I don't go on solo trips anymore. I don't camp without cell service. And I always, always make sure someone knows exactly where I am. That week in the cabin was supposed to help me disconnect from the world. Instead, it made me see just how close danger can be, even in the quietest places. I was 33 when I decided to take a week off from my job at the warehouse in Raleigh, North Carolina. It was early October 2019, and the stress had been building for months. My supervisor had been giving me longer hours, I had been skipping meals, sleeping late, waking up earlier, and my body was starting to feel it. I didn't have a family of my own, just me and my small 2-bedroom apartment. I hadn't been on a real trip in over 5 years. I remembered a cabin that used to belong to my Uncle Roy, up in the western part of Virginia. He'd passed away a couple of years ago, and the cabin was left abandoned, more or less forgotten. It sat on a stretch of old hunting land near Covington. Deep woods, nothing but trees and small roads leading up into the hills. There were no neighbors for at least 2 miles in any direction. The cabin didn't have running water anymore, and the electricity was only sort of working when it wanted to. But the place always gave me a strange sense of calm. I figured if I wanted peace and quiet, there was no better place to get it. I packed some basic supplies: canned food, instant coffee, bottled water, a flashlight, a small generator, some old tools, and loaded everything into my truck. I brought a .22 rifle just in case, mostly for animals. I didn't plan on hunting, but out there in the woods, you never really knew what could show up. I left early in the morning on a Tuesday, right after the sun came up. The drive took about 4.5 hours. The closer I got, the fewer cars I saw. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, it felt like I was the last person left on Earth. The cabin was still there, tucked between tall pines and hidden from the main trail by overgrowth. A little weather-worn and sagging, but not falling apart. I parked behind it and started unloading my things. The air smelled like dry leaves and wood smoke. I felt the stress start to fall off my shoulders just being out there. For a while anyway. The first night passed quietly. I lit a fire in the wood stove, set up my sleeping bag in the bedroom, and spent some time sitting on the porch, listening to the crickets and the occasional rustling in the trees. I had brought a couple of old paperbacks and spent most of the evening reading by flashlight. No signal on my phone, of course, but I expected that. The next day, I went for a long walk down the old trail that ran behind the cabin. It used to lead to a creek where we fished when I was a kid. The trail was mostly covered in leaves and branches, but I followed it out of memory. I saw animal tracks here and there, deer mostly, maybe a coyote or two. It felt good to be out in the open air, breathing deep and not hearing engines or sirens. When I got back to the cabin, I cracked open a can of beans, warmed them up, and sat outside while I ate. That's when I first noticed something strange. It was just a distant sound. A thud, like something heavy dropping in the woods. Then silence, not too far off, maybe 100 yards or so. I stood up and stared into the trees. Nothing moved. I listened for a minute, then shrugged it off. Could have been a branch falling, or a deer knocking something over. The woods are full of noises that don't mean anything. But that night, something woke me up. It was past midnight. The cabin was dark except for the dim red light on my portable generator's meter. I lay still, not sure at first what had snapped me out of sleep. Then I heard it again. A soft creak, like a footstep, on wood, came from the porch. My heart started thudding hard in my chest. I sat up slowly, keeping quiet, and grabbed the flashlight from beside my sleeping bag. I clicked it on and swept the beam toward the window facing the porch. Nothing. I didn't see anything out there, but something was different. The crickets had stopped. Total silence outside. That kind of silence that feels loud in your ears. I got up, crept across the room, and eased the front door open just a crack. I shined the light onto the porch. It was empty. The old boards creaked again as I stepped out. I panned the flashlight across the clearing, into the woods. Still nothing. No eye shine, no animals. I stayed out there for a while, just listening. Then I turned and went back inside. I locked the door, shut the windows, and laid back down. I didn't fall asleep for a long time. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place, but I saw something in the dirt by the stairs. A boot print, not mine. It was bigger, wider, and deeper. Fresh, just one, but it hadn't been there the day before. I stayed around the cabin most of that day. Something about that print kept itching at me. I tried to shake it off. Told myself it could have been there before and I just missed it. But I kept checking the tree-line, listening harder than usual. That night, I locked everything up tighter and moved the generator inside. I didn't sleep well. Early the next morning, I stepped outside with my coffee and saw tire tracks coming up the gravel road. They looked fresh, not like mine. These were different tread patterns, and I could see how they curved up toward the cabin, stopped just short of the clearing, then backed out. Like whoever was driving had second thoughts about coming closer. I followed them back a little ways, but they vanished where the road hardened again. I stood there, hands in my pockets, heart picking up speed. Someone else had come up here, watched the cabin, then left. I started thinking maybe I should cut the trip short. Something about it all was just feeling wrong. I decided I'd leave in the morning after one last night. I pack up at sunrise and head back to Raleigh. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. That night, it all changed. It was just after 10 p.m. I was sitting in the main room, reading by flashlight again, when I heard the noise. An engine, off in the distance, getting closer. My stomach dropped. I turned off the light and moved to the window. I peered out through the cracked blinds. Headlights appeared through the trees. A truck. It rolled slowly up the gravel road, tires crunching. It pulled into the clearing in front of the cabin and stopped. Lights stayed on. Then the engine shut off. I stayed still, my breath shallow. My rifle was leaning in the corner by the door. I didn't move for it yet. I just watched. Two men got out, tall, both wearing jackets. One had a cap pulled low. The other carried something in his hand. Looked like a crowbar or maybe a tire iron. They stood by the truck for a few seconds, talking. Then they started walking toward the cabin. I grabbed the rifle and backed into the corner, heart racing so hard I could barely hear. They didn't knock, just came straight up the porch steps. I heard them testing the door quietly at first, then more forcefully. I chambered around. They pushed hard, but the door held. One of them circled around the back. I heard a window shatter. Glass hit the floor in the back room. That's when I moved. I darted through the bedroom, shut the door behind me, and crouched by the bed. I aimed the rifle at the broken window. I didn't want to shoot anyone, but I wasn't about to wait and see what they wanted. The man with the crowbar climbed halfway through the window. I shouted at him to stop, and when he didn't, I fired a warning shot into the floorboards. That did it. He dropped back outside, swearing. I could hear both of them scrambling away, crashing through the brush toward their truck. I stayed frozen for a few minutes, heart hammering in my ears. The engine roared to life.
Tirespun.
They tore off down the gravel road, leaving dust in their wake. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun came up, I packed everything into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't drink coffee. I just loaded up and drove. I checked my rearview mirror the whole way back to Raleigh, paranoid, watching every car that got too close. Later that week, I reported the break-in to the county sheriff out in Covington. They sent someone to check the cabin, but nothing came of it. No arrests, no fingerprints, nothing. Just a broken window and a few scuffed boot prints. They figured it was just squatters or some drug runners moving through the hills. Happens more than people realize, especially out in the rural places. I never went back to that cabin. A few months later, I sold the land through a lawyer. Got rid of the deed and made sure my name wasn't attached to any of it anymore. I still think about it sometimes. That quiet week I wanted so bad. How it turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I don't know what those men were planning to do if they had gotten inside. I don't want to know. Maybe they thought the place was still abandoned. Or maybe they knew I was there and they just didn't care. That's the part that gets under my skin. The not knowing. I still keep the rifle close, even in my apartment. And every time I hear something at night, I think about the creak of those porch boards, the shattered window, the way those men didn't hesitate. It wasn't a ghost story. It was real, and that's what makes it worse. The rain had started falling heavily by the time I turned onto the winding dirt road that led to the cabin. I'd been driving for hours through the thick woods that seemed to stretch on forever. My headlights sliced through the darkness, revealing a narrow path, muddy and slick from the rain. I couldn't help but feel a sinking sensation in my stomach. Something about this place didn't feel right, but I had to press on. It was too late to turn back now. I had rented this cabin for a week to get away from the city. The noise, the constant bustle, the never-ending stream of people. It had all become too much. I needed peace, silence, a place to clear my head. That's what the ad said. Anyway, a secluded cabin in the middle of the woods, perfect for a solo retreat. What I didn't realize when I booked it was how far off the grid it truly was. The cabin was isolated, nearly impossible to reach unless you were familiar with the area. And now, as the rain beat down harder and the wind howled through the trees, I began to feel the weight of my decision. By the time I parked in front of the cabin, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour. The air felt heavy, thick with moisture. I grabbed my bag and hurried inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped into a dimly lit room that smelled of wood and damp earth. The place was old, but sturdy. The wooden floors groaned under my feet, and the walls were adorned with old photographs and faded tapestries. It wasn't fancy, but it had character. The fireplace in the corner seemed inviting, and I couldn't wait to get a fire going. I unpacked my things quickly and set to work on getting the fire started. The cabin's wood stove looked like it hadn't been used in ages, but I managed to get a small fire going. The warmth spread through the room, and I sighed in relief. The chill that had settled in my bones from the long drive was slowly starting to dissipate. I decided to take a walk to stretch my legs after being cooped up in the car for so long. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the woods outside looked eerie but peaceful in the gray light. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath me. As I gazed out into the woods, something caught my eye. A shadow moved between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. I froze, my heart racing, but when I looked again, the shadow was gone. I shook it off. It was probably an animal or maybe just the wind playing tricks with my mind. I wasn't used to being alone in such an isolated place. It was probably nothing. I headed back inside, trying to push the unease out of my mind. The hours passed quietly as I settled in. I spent most of the evening reading and watching the fire crackle in the hearth. But the longer I sat there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. The storm outside was picking up again, and the wind howled as it rattled the windows. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to burst open. Around midnight, I heard a noise. It was faint, just a whisper at first, but it came from outside. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I stood up, my heart racing, straining to hear over the pounding rain. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be stealthy. They were moving deliberately, like they wanted me to know they were out there. I grabbed the flashlight off the table and stepped cautiously to the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I hesitated. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what was out there, but my curiosity got the better of me. I swung the door open. The night air hit me with a rush of cold, and I shined the flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind, the rain coming down in sheets, and the quiet hum of the storm. I let out a shaky breath, feeling like a fool for getting so worked up. But then, as I stepped back inside, I noticed something. A faint set of muddy footprints leading away from the porch and into the woods. I froze. Someone had been standing there, just outside, and they had been watching me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every creak of the cabin and every gust of wind that rattled the windows. The storm seemed to intensify, the rain coming down in sheets. I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut, but every time I glanced at the door, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was out there, waiting. Morning came, but the storm showed no signs of letting up. I didn't want to be stuck in the cabin all day, so I decided to go for a hike. I figured that getting some fresh air would help clear my head and take my mind off the strange events of the night before. I grabbed my raincoat and headed out, taking a different path this time, away from the cabin. The woods were quiet, eerily so. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the steady drip of rain from the trees. As I walked deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing. I decided to head back to the cabin after about an hour. The trail had become more difficult to navigate, and the rain was picking up again. I was wet and cold, and I just wanted to get back inside. But as I approached the clearing where the cabin should have been, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The cabin was no longer where it should have been. It had been moved. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, the cabin was gone. In its place stood only a small, decaying shack, overgrown with ivy and moss. The foundation was cracked, the windows broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. There was no sign of the cabin I had stayed in the night before. My heart raced as I stumbled backward, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I turned and ran back down the trail, panic rising in my chest. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. But as I ran, I felt something cold and sharp brush against the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My breath came in ragged gasps as I kept running, my feet slipping in the mud, the woods seeming to close in around me. I didn't stop until I reached the road, but when I turned to look back, the shack was gone, and the cabin had returned. The same one I had stayed in the night before, standing silently in the rain. I couldn't make sense of it, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to leave. I got back into my car and sped off down the road, never looking back. And I never spoke of what happened in those woods again. But I would never forget the feeling of being watched, the sense that something was waiting for me, just out of sight, and the knowledge that whatever it wasn't human. I made it out of those woods alive, but I was never the same after that night. The feeling that someone or something had been watching me stayed with me long after I left. I couldn't help but wonder if I had narrowly escaped something far more sinister than I could comprehend. The events of that night didn't make sense, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I knew deep down that I had come too close to something dark and terrifying. The memories of the abandoned shack, the muddy footprints, the shifting cabin, they stayed with me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that the woods had a way of trapping people, of making them lose their way, of hiding whatever evil lurked there. It was a part of me now, a part that would never fade. And though I eventually found peace elsewhere, every time I heard a creak in the floor or felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, I couldn't help but wonder, what was out there? In those woods? What had I really encountered? And what if one day it came looking for me again? It was mid-November, and the air had a bite to it. The kind of cold that clung to your bones no matter how many layers you put on. I was 28 years old. My name's Kyle, and I was supposed to be enjoying the peace and quiet of the remote cabin I'd rented for a weekend of solitude. I needed a break. Away from the noise, the city, the people who never stopped talking. And a cabin seemed perfect. It was an old wooden structure, built with thick logs, nestled deep in the woods of northern Michigan, far from any neighbors or towns. I had found it online in some niche vacation rental site that promised seclusion. The pictures looked great. The cabin looked like it had been well kept. Rustic, yes, but cozy. The reviews, too, were positive, claiming that it was an ideal place for nature lovers or anyone wanting to disconnect for a while. The drive to the cabin had been longer than I expected. The winding roads had turned into narrow dirt paths, overgrown with brush, and I had to keep my eyes peeled to make sure I didn't get lost. The GPS had shown that I was almost there, but as I turned a corner, I saw it. The cabin, sitting in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. It looked different from the pictures. The outside had a weathered look, like it had been neglected for years, though it seemed stable enough. The front porch sagged a little, but the door was locked with a rusty old padlock. A small, hand-painted sign hung from one of the beams. It read, "Welcome, enjoy your stay." The words felt almost too cheery for how lonely and desolate the place felt. Still, it was exactly what I was looking for, quiet and isolated. Maybe too isolated. I unloaded my things, set up a small campfire outside to keep warm, and settled in. The first evening passed slowly, but the peace was welcome. I enjoyed the sound of the crackling fire and the chirping of crickets. There was no light pollution here, no buzzing streetlights, no distant traffic noise, just the pure, untouched silence of the woods. The only sign of life was a few deer that passed through the clearing at dusk. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the cabin. It was just the wind, I told myself, but there was something unsettling about the way it howled, as if it had a purpose, like it was trying to say something. I shrugged it off, blaming it on the isolation. I hadn't been away from people in so long that I was starting to feel paranoid. I awoke the next morning with the sun barely creeping through the trees. It was colder than I expected. The fire had died out during the night, and a thick frost had covered the windows. My breath came out in visible puffs as I stumbled out of bed. I wasn't exactly a morning person, but I had no plans for the day other than exploring the woods a bit. When I opened the door to go outside, the air smelled fresh and crisp. The ground was still frozen from the previous night's cold, but the sun was starting to warm it up. The forest was quiet, too quiet almost. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed something odd. There was a path leading away from the cabin that I hadn't seen the night before. It was narrow and barely visible through the thick underbrush, but it was there. I wasn't sure if it was an animal trail or something else, but curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it. I hadn't walked far when I came across another structure, hidden deeper in the woods. It was another cabin, but this one was even older. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the wood was so weathered it looked like it could collapse at any moment. The windows were broken, and the door hung off its hinges, barely clinging to the frame. A deep sense of unease settled in my stomach, but I couldn't resist. I walked closer to the cabin, the crunching of leaves beneath my boots the only sound in the otherwise dead silence. The closer I got, the more I felt a strange pressure in the air, as if something was watching me. Something was wrong about this place, and it took me a few moments to put my finger on it. There were no animal tracks around the cabin, no birds flying overhead, just an unnatural quiet. I stepped cautiously onto the porch, the old wood creaking beneath my feet. The door swung open with a push, letting out a loud groan. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and decay. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight as I carefully made my way through the dark, musty interior. There was no sign of anyone having been there recently. No belongings left behind, no signs of life, just decay. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, but as I looked around, I noticed something strange. There was a faint old stain on the wooden floor, something dark. It didn't look like rust, or at least not entirely. I crouched down to inspect it, and as I did, I noticed something else. A thin line of what appeared to be dried blood ran along the floor, leading to a small, boarded-up window at the back. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something off about this place. It didn't just feel abandoned, it felt abandoned for a reason. I backed out of the cabin quickly, my heart racing. I was about to turn and leave when I heard a sound, a scraping noise, faint but distinct. I froze, trying to listen. It came again, louder this time, like something being dragged across the ground. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned around slowly. There was no one there, but the air was thick with tension. Felt like something was just out of sight, watching me. I didn't want to be here anymore, not in this place. As I started walking back toward the main cabin, I felt the oppressive silence settle in around me once again. The path I had followed to this second cabin now felt like a mistake, and I was suddenly eager to get back to the safety of the cabin I had rented. I could still hear that scraping sound in my mind, even though it had stopped. When I reached the main cabin, I bolted the door shut behind me. The fire was long dead, and the cold crept into the room quickly, but I wasn't in the mood to rebuild it. I was too shaken up. I needed to sleep, to shake off the strange feelings that had settled in my chest. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, listening to the howling wind and the creaking of the old house. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. But there was something about that second cabin. Something about the way it had felt so wrong, so abandoned with no explanation. My mind kept going back to the bloodstain on the floor. I didn't sleep much that night. When the morning came, I packed up my things early. I wasn't going to stay any longer. As I was leaving, I stopped to look back at the second cabin one last time. The woods were still, the trees motionless in the windless air. But as I glanced at the broken windows, I thought I saw something move behind them, a shadow. It was brief, just a flicker, but it made my skin crawl. I didn't want to stay to find out what it was. The drive back felt long, but as I passed the last stretch of forest and finally saw the main road ahead, I felt a sense of relief. Even though I never spoke about it to anyone, I'll never forget that cabin. It wasn't just abandoned, it was abandoned for a reason. And that reason, I'm afraid, was something I'd never be able to fully understand. But whatever it was, I knew I'd be glad to never return. It had been a few years since I moved out to the remote cabin in the Lake District, tucked away from the bustle of everyday life. I was hoping for peace, for quiet, away from the noise of the world. I was 32 years old, living alone, and had found work as a freelance writer, which meant my schedule was flexible. I enjoyed the solitude, the isolation, the ability to work without distractions. The closest village was over 20 miles away, and the cabin itself was nestled deep within the woods, accessible only by a narrow, winding road. The land was vast, with dense trees and steep hills surrounding the cabin, creating a sort of natural fortress. The air was fresh, clean, and the bird song in the morning was the only sound that filled my ears. In winter, it was even more isolated, with snow covering everything, muting the world in a thick, cold silence. I found comfort in the stillness, the way the nights stretched on forever with nothing to do but think, write, and occasionally stoke the fire. The cabin, though small and simple, felt like home. A crackling fire in the hearth, the scent of pine wood, and the soft creaking of the wooden floors when the wind howled outside made it a place of refuge. That was until she came. It started with a series of strange events. Nothing overtly frightening at first, just little things that gnawed at the back of my mind, leaving me unsettled. It was a late October afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds and the wind howling through the trees. The weather in the Lake District can be unpredictable, and it was a bit of a relief when the rain finally began to pour down. I settled into my usual routine of writing at my desk by the window, watching the rain streak across the glass. I remember hearing the sound of footsteps outside, slow, deliberate. My first instinct was to dismiss it, assuming it was just a deer or perhaps a fox roaming through the underbrush. But then, the footsteps came closer, stopping right outside my door. My heart began to race. The wind was loud, but there was something else, a faint scraping sound. I stood up, hesitant, and slowly approached the door, peering through the small window next to it. There was nothing, just the thick, wet darkness of the forest. I felt foolish for being so on edge, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I returned to my desk, trying to calm myself, but the feeling lingered. For the rest of the afternoon, I couldn't focus on my work, constantly distracted by the thought that someone might be lurking just outside. When evening came, the unease only deepened. The wind had picked up, and the rain was now falling in sheets, battering against the windows. As I prepared dinner, I thought I saw a figure moving through the trees, a shadow darting between them. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that the storm was messing with my perception. But when the figure emerged from the trees and started walking toward the cabin, I knew something wasn't right. She appeared to be a woman, tall, thin, with long, wet hair that hung loosely around her shoulders. She wore a simple dress, though it was strange for the time of year. The fabric clung to her body, soaked through with rain. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, but there was something in her eyes that made my stomach twist, something hollow, something unsettling. I stood frozen, watching her approach. She didn't seem to notice the cabin at first, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. Then, as if drawn by some unseen force, she turned and started walking directly toward my door. My instincts screamed at me to hide, to do anything but stand there, but I couldn't move. The knocking came shortly after. It was soft, almost tentative at first, like a whisper in the night. I didn't answer, couldn't. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Should I call the police? What if she was lost? What if she needed help? But a deeper part of me, a primal instinct, told me not to open that door. Not for anyone. The knocking continued, growing more urgent. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room as if looking for something, anything, to make me feel safe. My fingers trembled as I reached for the phone, but there was no signal out here, not for miles. I couldn't even get a simple text out. I was alone. The rain grew louder, the wind howling outside, but through it all, I could hear her voice, soft and muffled. like she was speaking to someone, or maybe herself. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong, distant. I crouched down, pressing myself against the wall, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I thought I saw her shadow through the window, the faintest outline of her moving just outside. For what felt like hours, I sat there, waiting. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The wind howled louder, the storm becoming even more intense. I finally gathered enough courage to look outside again, but the woman was gone. There was no trace of her, no sign that she had ever been there. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I locked every window and door, making sure the cabin was as secure as possible. But even after everything was sealed tight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if she was still out there, just waiting for me to make a move. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was still overcast, but the rain had stopped. I decided to go out and see if I could find any sign of the woman, but there was nothing. The woods were as quiet as ever. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs that anyone had passed through the area. It was as if she had never been there. Days passed, and the eerie feeling began to fade, though I never forgot her. I tried to tell myself it was just a figment of my imagination, that the isolation had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The feeling of being watched didn't leave. It lingered in the corners of my mind, like a shadow that never fully went away. A week later, I was out for a walk, trying to clear my head. The forest had a way of soothing me, of giving me space to think. As I walked, I stumbled upon something unexpected. A small, weathered bundle of clothing lying on the forest floor. I froze, my heart racing. It was a woman's dress, the same one the woman had been wearing that night. I picked it up cautiously, holding it by the hem. It was soaked with rain, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The fabric was old, worn, and the stitching was uneven, almost hastily done. As I turned it over, something fell out of the pocket. A small, crumpled photograph. I unfolded it carefully, my hands shaking. The photo showed a woman standing in front of a cabin, her face pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was smiling, but there was no warmth in her expression. It was as if she were trapped in the photo, unable to escape. I didn't know what to make of it. The photograph didn't make sense. The woman in the picture was unmistakably the same woman I had seen at the cabin. But how? How had this photograph ended up here in the woods? My mind raced. Could she have been here before? Had she lived in this cabin? I went back to the cabin that night, determined to figure out what was going on. I searched the entire cabin, looking for any clue that could explain what had happened. It wasn't until I opened the attic door that I found something that made my blood run cold. The attic was small, barely enough room to stand, but it was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and dusty antiques. I was rummaging through one of the boxes when I found something wrapped in an old, faded blanket. I unwrapped it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a journal, the pages yellowed with age, the ink smudged in places but still legible. The journal belonged to a woman named Evelyn, the previous owner of the cabin. She wrote about her life here, the solitude, the peace she found in the woods. But as the entries progressed, they grew darker. She wrote about hearing voices in the night, about seeing things in the forest, about a woman who would visit her at the cabin, a woman she couldn't escape. The entries became more erratic, more desperate, until the last one simply read, "She's here. She never leaves. She's always watching." The journal ended there. I didn't need to read any more to understand what had happened. Evelyn had become obsessed with the woman, the one who had visited her, the one who wouldn't leave. I couldn't say for sure what happened to her, but I suspected she had never truly left the cabin. That woman, that eerie figure I had seen in the woods, had likely been Evelyn all along, trapped in some endless loop of her own making. I never saw her again after that day. Maybe she was a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of the isolation I had come to crave. Or maybe she was still out there, waiting for someone else to come to the cabin, someone else to be trapped in her nightmare. Either way, I left the cabin shortly after. I sold the place and moved back to the city, where the noise and people were enough to drown out the memories. But every so often, I wonder if someone else will find that cabin, if someone else will see her, if she'll come for them next.